Welcome to our 11th and final CAHRS webcast for 2020. My name is Brad Bell. I'm the William J. Conaty Professor of Strategic Human Resources here in the ILR School. I also serve as the Academic Director of CAHRS. Very happy to have all of you joining us for our webcast today, which will be focusing on the impact of the changing work environment on the HRBP role. Our presenter today will be Beth Flynn-Ferry, who serves as the Executive Director of CAHRS and also has over 20 years of experience in a variety of HR roles, including HRBP, so she's very familiar with today's topic. So just to give you a little context for what we're going to be talking about today, certainly if nothing else, 2020 has really shown us how quickly the world of work can change. From the pandemic, which has had a variety of different effects, including changing how and where we work, to a host of different societal issues which have had a significant impact on employees. These changes have really required not only organizations, but also HR functions to adjust, and that means a changing and evolving role for the HR business partner. To better understand exactly the implications that these changes are having for the HRBP role, CAHRS recently hosted a working group with a number of our CAHRS partner companies, as well as conducted some other research to better understand exactly how our partners are thinking about the role and what some of the implications may be coming out of the pandemic. The goal of today's webcast is really to share some of the key learnings that have emerged from this work, as well as to hear some of your own experiences and questions. During the first part of the webcast, Beth will be sharing some of those key findings that emerge from the research. While she's presenting, I really encourage you to please share your questions, either in the Q&A function that you'll see there in Zoom or in the chat. Either way, I'll see them and we'll be able to note those, and we'll pick up your questions at the end of today's session. So with that, I will turn it over to Beth to kind of highlight some of the research.
Great, thanks Brad, and good to see everybody here today. I did want to share the research from the working group, as well as the interviews I did with a number of folks from CAHRS companies and other companies as well, as far as how the pandemic and other things happening in the world today are impacting the role of the human resources business partner. So certainly companies' approaches to their businesses and workforces have changed, and that's really necessitated HR to also modify its approach and practices. And this is evident throughout HR, through the three legs of the stool, but probably most impacted right now has been the HR business partner role, because it's really at the nexus of the employee and company relationship. So I want to share really 4 points that were made through the conversations that we had, and give you some detail on each of those. So the first one is really that most of the HR business partners we spoke to felt that really the work that you're doing is the same, but the ways that we're doing it is very new, very different, and very challenging. So this is not only due to the pandemic, although obviously that's a big one, because that's what forced all of us to go remote and in most of your workplaces, but also due to the murder of George Floyd, and issues that were under the surface in that realm also came to the top. And then we had the politics that were happening as well. So one key change that really is something I think HR has been thinking about for many years and companies wanted to move to is this idea of shifting at looking at performance from an activity-based type of measurement system to more of an outcome-based one. And so I think that's something that we've always talked about and always wanted to do, but in working that the way that we're working right now is really forcing us to look more at those KPIs versus just activities. Related to that is the second point of, how do managers and how does HR stay connected to employees with the way that we're working right now? And this is a challenge not only due to the fast pivot that many of your companies made to working remotely, but also due to the things like the unique at-home challenges of, first of all, having kids just be home during the pandemic when schools shut down, and then the adjustment to remote learning, and all the supervision and things that parents have to do to keep that afloat while still trying to maintain their roles. In addition to that, you're all dealing with illness in your families, in your own or in your extended families. And how do you deal with that? How do you support your own family when you're quarantined or you have someone else that is? And so that obviously created some new challenges. And HR business partners have really always prided themselves on being the pulse with what's happening with their employees, and really, trying to problem solve, to diagnose what's happening, and to help inform managers around that as well, so that employee engagement stays high, performance stays high, et cetera. And obviously that became a big challenge right now. Now, HRBPs that had been enrolled quite a while really took the opportunity to leverage the trust that they built with their employees or with their managers and leaders to stay connected. And that really allowed them to stay in touch. And it's probably a good lesson for all of us to think about how important building trust and building those relationships are when something like this happens. What the HRBPs I talked to mentioned was, frequent informal conversations were really more effective than formal ones, really getting personal with people, which sometimes in the past has been uncomfortable for us and for managers, but it really is the right approach to take in a time like this. Also, technologies like Slack, pulse surveys were other tools that HRBPs were using to stay connected and really to stay on top of what are our employees experiencing now, because that obviously evolved over the course of the pandemic and with new challenges that came their way. And companies also mentioned that they haven't quite solved this yet. They're looking at newer technologies to stay in touch, things to replace the hallway conversations, the water cooler talk. And right now we've seen a lot of things where people are trying to stay connected over the holidays and do some different things via Zoom activities, et cetera. And so we continue to try to unpack what are the ways that we can make those very real, very authentic connections with our employees to make sure we're understanding what's happening, translating that back to the business and back to our managers. Another thing we heard, or the third thing we heard in the conversations we had, that the whole transformation we've been going through with HR wanting to be a more strategic business partner felt like it regressed a little bit. And so, this idea of being strategic in a crisis felt more tactical. And so, some of the BPs were really struggling with this. As I thought about it though, while in the moment that may not feel strategic, this was a textbook example of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and really being at the bottom of that hierarchy, right? We'd progressed to the top with all this data and analytics and everything else, and this really took us right back down to the bottom. We really needed to focus on physiological and safety needs, and those took priority right now. And while that feels tactical, the importance of doing things right for employees is paramount to how they feel about their leaders, about HR, and about the company in all. And if we're looking for engagement, if we're looking for higher performance, these are the things that are really important. This crisis also allowed our leaders to be more authentic, right? To show the human sides of themselves, to relate to what's going on in everyone's homes right at this particular time. And so those are things that are outcomes from maybe the tactical piece of the crisis, but are really important, I think, for the long term. And the other thing that companies are certainly taking away from this is, I remember when I was in industry, and the idea of updating that crisis management plan every year it just felt like an exercise, right? Well, it's no longer an exercise. That is something that, obviously organizations are taking very seriously. We know this won't be the last time something like this happens. And so it's more critical than ever that we look at those crisis management plans and take some of the things that we learned from this and apply them to the future. This also could focus on things like what needs to shift now from the HRBP desk to shared services, what are new capabilities needed for managers, and these are all really strategic actions that will set companies up well for the future. The fourth and last area I wanted to mention today, so you can be thinking about some questions maybe in these areas, was the role that HR has elevated into with the diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges and the mental health challenges. And we've really moved into advocacy roles there. While we've long been the champions of DE&I, it's always been on the HR agenda. Sometimes it's felt like an uphill push as far as engaging with leaders on the importance of this. And so, right now it's more important than ever, maybe not ever, but certainly in recent history. And so while many DE&I strategies are certainly driven by the centers, Center of Excellence in this regard, it's really the HRBPs on the front lines supporting it, advocating it, and advising managers on it that's really going to make the difference. I know a few of the companies I talked to, their HRBPs felt like they had more permission than ever to be a DE&I challenger, right? So really be pushing for things, advocating for changes, making sure there's increased hiring, diverse hiring, promotion slates, et cetera. And companies talked a lot about investing in building skills here across their employee population. So, we've been talking about things like unconscious bias and leadership traits and things like that in DE&I for a long time, but companies now are really taking those very seriously. Related to this is the role that fell to HR when it came to mental health and wellness. HRBPs became the first responders, in this area in your companies, and had to provide things like mental health first aid. I heard one company call it, or triage in this area. And I know it's one that many of us feel like, we're not experts in. And so that's obviously uncovered an area that companies need to be thinking about. They need to be building capabilities in this area, and also thinking about, who does own this? Who owns mental health and well-being? Is it HR? Is it your medical teams? Is it a combination of different things? But I think the one of the nice outcomes of this of the pandemic has been the more open conversation we're having about mental health and DE&I. Because these issues have been around for a long time. Mental health especially, I think, when we get out of the pandemic, there still will be a relentlessness to the business cycle that employees were feeling prior to this that needs to be addressed. And so companies need to continue to establish plans moving forward. The CAHRS organization had developed a HR business partner senior leader kind of key role and responsibilities and capabilities study a few years ago. And we did pull that out and take a look at the key roles. These are the four that we have mentioned before: organizational effectiveness, talent strategy, leadership development, coaching, and advising. And based on the research that we just did, this model, these four key roles hold true today. And I think there are a few nuances though in some of that, so I will mention it. Coaching and advising has definitely increased with the new challenges that leaders and organizations are facing. Leaders really were relying on their HR partners to advise them in areas that have long been part of a focus of HR, but they're finally ready to engage in, DE&I, flexibility, empathy as examples. And if you think about OE, this is also dialed up, with remote work and the increased importance of being both the voice of the employee and the voice of the business. Businesses are shifting their work models, and so org design needs to be looked at as a part of organizational effectiveness. For example, many of our companies are moving from bricks and mortar businesses to e-commerce, and what does that mean about how your organization is designed, what skills and capabilities you need, and promoting effectiveness. Talent strategy continues to be important given the business fluctuations. So some companies are booming and looking to hire a bunch of people. Others are certainly more challenged. Saw some great work with a number of CAHRS companies banding together to really talk about where there are talent gaps and when there are talent overages and sharing people in that sense. But we also need to look at reskilling and upskilling as well in the organizations. And then the last one, leadership development. I would say at the beginning of the pandemic really went on hiatus and lost some focus, but the feeling right now is that that is on the rise when it comes to developing manager capability. Right now, that is something that many of our organizations are focusing. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Brad.
Great, thanks, Beth. Lots of great findings there. We have a few questions that have come in already, which we'll get to here in a second. Encourage others to please submit your questions, again, either through the chat or the Q&A, and we'll take as many as we can in the time that we have available. So the first question, Beth, kind of goes to one of the first points you made about the need for HRBPs to really stay connected with employees and find new ways to do that, given the shift largely to remote work. And you mentioned, companies haven't really, solved it yet. I mean, they've come up with, some strategies perhaps, but haven't solved it and are looking at kind of new ways to get at this. So, the question kind of asks, what were some of the challenges that HRBPs faced in kind of making those authentic connections? And did you hear any kind of solutions that companies were considering or exploring or, talking about?
Yeah, a lot of it depends certainly on the culture of the company, I think, and what the culture was like prior to this and what it's like today. As I mentioned, certainly if you were a business partner sitting in that chair already and had established relationships with your teams and the folks that you were supporting and partnering with, it felt a little bit more seamless, right? You could still hold the same kind of meetings via Zoom or Skype or whatever technology you're using. But, it's still very hard to read people on Zoom or, using a technology. You miss the nuances. You don't see, the folded arms maybe, or the size or the eye contact that you're making. And so, some of the tricks I heard was really, that HR business partner setting the example for maybe opening up, or the leader setting the example for opening up, sharing, some of the challenges that they're having, being open and honest about that. And if you set the tone that way as a leader or as the HR business partner encouraging that, that goes a long way towards making sure the dialogue's open and you're figuring things out. Simple things too, like I mentioned, doing informal check-ins kind of without an agenda, right? So, you don't want to catch people off guard. So you might want to schedule it, but you might schedule it for 10 minutes versus a half an hour meeting and just, call it a check-in and not talk about work, just talk about, what's happening in people's lives. I mean, it's really hard to do one-to-one depending on, how big your team is, but maybe triage that by, cascading it. So you do some and set the example with your leaders, and then have your leaders do that with their teams. And so you're building capability by doing that as we speak. So those are a couple of the things mentioned.
Great ideas. So another question here from Olivia, and maybe I'll field this one. This kind of aligns with some work that I do. The question is, are there studies that look at whether working from home can diminish employee engagement with the company and coworkers? It's a great question, Olivia. I think, first thing I would say is thinking about, how are we thinking about engagement, right? So what the research suggests is that, remote work, telecommuting often has many positive, effects on employees. It often increases job satisfaction. It can create organizational commitment. It can enhance or reduce work-family conflict. So, many dimensions of engagement are positively affected, I would say. What research does show, however, is that unsurprisingly, remote workers can become somewhat isolated, and that can make it harder for them to build as well as maintain relationships with coworkers. What's interesting is the research suggests that remote workers do a pretty good job of maintaining relationships with their supervisors. The relationships that tend to suffer the most are those with peers, perhaps because those are often more social. Maybe they're not, as Beth was just saying, more kind of formalized, right? We often have formal touch points with our supervisors or managers. that allow us to maintain those relationships. So I think the kind of risks for companies to be aware of is, do you see a deterioration of kind of peer networks when people shift to remote work? You know, what's really been interesting through the recent pandemic is that everyone has shifted remotely. And so I think that's leveled the playing field a bit, and probably we haven't seen as much of those effects, but I think we're likely to see some of those social effects of remote work emerge again or become more salient when we have some employees going back to the office, and maybe some others staying at home, kind of working across some of these different work models. So another question, Beth, that came in is, and I think it's a really important one, you talked about, how are HRBPs supporting the kind of mental health and well-being of, managers, employees. But this question is kind of, what are companies doing to support the mental health and well-being of HRBPs themselves, right? Obviously, they've really taken on significant workload in recent months and a lot of demand. So what are companies doing to kind of help support their HRBP populations?
Yeah, and that was a big point of discussion in the working group where the HRBPs really felt the weight of everything that was happening. And while it's been, provided tremendous opportunities for HR, it certainly has had its share of burdens as well. I think, companies that don't have an HR for HR point person, this is the exact time that you need someone like that, someone that, is focusing only on what the needs of HR are and surfacing those to the CHRO and making sure that they're taken care of. I've heard a couple of things. One of our CAHRS companies is shutting down their headquarters over the Christmas holiday for close to, I think it's 10 days. So the whole headquarters, they do have field locations that are going to be operating, but the headquarters are shutting down. And so, and they're not taking that out of vacation and things like that. But because everyone is shutting down, nobody is feeling the undue burden of, well, if I take some time off, things are going to pile up. And certainly companies have been encouraging people to take time off, but if you're going to feel stressed while you're gone, it's kind of hard to do that. So I would encourage companies to be thinking holistically about their employees. This should apply to HR as well, to take care of some of those needs and give people some time truly away from work and away from the stress and the burdens. The other thing is, certainly leveraging EAPs and all that is something that HR should be doing, but I think it's skilling, giving skills and capabilities to HR that really help us feel competent in dealing with some of these things, because there's nothing worse than a million things coming at you. You're trying to solve problems, but you don't feel like you have the information and capability. So I've heard of companies providing expertise, or access to experts. So they may be making presentations and educating you on mental health and wellness, for example, but also giving you access to those experts to ask your questions. And those questions could be about you personally, or they could be things that are for you personally, but obviously apply to the broader workforce as well. So you can kind of get it with a double whammy. The other thing I would say is, we have a few companies that have done some work on, kind of SWAT teams or fast action teams, some companies call them. And they've had them in place for things like strategic programs that they're trying to change or move the company in a different way. And I think on a more ongoing basis, we need some of those resources that can come in and relieve some of the pressure off of the HR teams on some of these specific issues. So some of our companies that have been doing that have been talking about adding resources there to help alleviate these things.
Great, thanks, Beth. So, I think we have time maybe for one more question. The question that came in kind of goes to, are you seeing shifts in the KPIs that are being used to kind of evaluate HRBPs, in particular, kind of a shift, maybe, what's the emphasis on kind of looking at outcomes versus activities? As you talked about, the role itself seems to be changing a lot. Is the way that companies are thinking about kind of HRBP performance itself, has that shifted at all with some of these changes?
You know, when we were talking about that, you know, we definitely talked about the shift from activity-based to outcome-based. We didn't really talk so much about the measures that we talked about were some of the typical ones around retention, attrition, recruitment performance, et cetera. But more of the conversation was around, you know, who is responsible for that and who should be measured for that. And it shouldn't just be HR, right? It should be a combination of your line leaders as well as your HR folks. And also, you know, so for HR measures, when I say that, but also for HR folks, there should be a combination of not only these HR measures, but business measures, right? So profit, loss, revenue, whatever, you know, whatever you're focusing on in your company from a business standpoint, those should be part of the HR team's KPIs as well, because that ties everything together.
Yeah. Makes sense and lines up with some of what we heard last week when RAs were talking about their mental health and well-being research, companies putting some of those kind of metrics right around, you know, from engagement surveys, well-being metrics, and using those to evaluate leaders and HR support.
Definitely.
Great. So we're almost out of time. So, you know, although, as I said at the beginning, this is our last event for 2020, we are in the process of setting up our schedule for 2021. We'll have a number of events showing up on our website soon, so we encourage you to check those out. We're very excited that we're actually going to be setting up 3 different series of working groups in the early half or first half of next year. The topics which you see on the screen here will be, the first one will focus on bringing employees back to the office. The second one, somewhat related to today's topic, will be rethinking the HR operational model. And the last series will focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Each of these series will consist of 3 or 4 working groups that will examine the topic or theme from a number of different perspectives and angles. So I really encourage you to explore those, see if there's any that match your interests, and consider registering for those working groups. We'll be posting other webcasts as well as other working groups as well throughout the year. So please check in with us often. Thank you again for joining us for today's session. Want to wish you happy holidays. It's certainly been an interesting and challenging year for everyone. So we really hope that you have an opportunity to step back, recharge here, and hit the ground running in 2021. So thanks again, and hope to see you at a future CAHRS event.